Okay, well, I've got 11:03, so maybe we'll start and do some quick introductions, and hopefully some other folks will join us. But again, we are going to be recording, so this will be up posted for anybody else who registered but ended up maybe not being able to make it. So with that, welcome everyone to our third installment of the Colorado chapter of the Energy Services Coalition's 2021 webinar series. So thank you for being here. I think this is a really timely webinar. We've seen the market evolving where, it's not only just our typical tax exempt lease purchase that we're seeing in the market, whether that's, inside of a performance contract or some things outside of a performance contract. So excited to have Zachary Martinez with Johnson Controls and Kip Barrett with Metris Energy. They're going to introduce themselves and talk a little bit more about what are some of those kind of alternative and evolving mechanisms. So with that, Zachary, I'm going to turn it over to you and you can take it away.
Thanks so much, John. I appreciate it. So yeah, by way of introduction, Zach Martinez, Johnson Controls. I'm part of our infrastructure as a service division here at Johnson. I'll be co-presenting with Kip Barrett. Kip, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Kip Barrett. I'm the Director of Business Development for Metris Energy. We finance large-scale sustainable energy efficiency third-party projects.
Thanks, Kip. We're excited to be chatting with you all today. The way we're going to kind of tackle our time together is to talk through kind of a narrowing funnel, if you will, starting with the broad kind of shift in the marketplace. And we'll get a little bit more specific as we work through our time together into how that may apply for the various kind of organizations on the call today, what that more tangible kind of takeaway may look like by the end here. So I want to start nice and broad. We'll kind of work our way down into exactly how that's going to impact kind of all the stakeholders on the call. And then we'll leave plenty of time at the end for question and answer. So as we're kind of chatting through this, if you wouldn't mind, for the sake of the recording, just taking notes on your questions, and we'll get to that question and answer session at the end, and we'll talk through and should have plenty of time to address any kind of concerns. To get started, I want to talk about what we are seeing in the broader marketplace as far as what clients of various organizations, industries, and structures are kind of asking for from an outcome perspective. And you're going to hear me use that word a lot today, outcomes being as opposed to a specific asset, as opposed to a specific piece of equipment. We're really talking about what is the benefit or the use of a given set or suite of technologies, assets, et cetera, and how do we kind of address the needs of those outcomes, okay? What this slide represents is what we have heard from the marketplace around those outcomes, around those needs, around what people are really looking for. You can see some examples on here, things like a healthy, resilient, and flexible building, right? Safety, security, data analytics, the efficiency of systems, utilizing technology, and again, being a financially effective or efficient kind of deployment around various different kind of asset suites and benefits from a building, an asset group, or a specific kind of asset type. And so I want to start again as broadly as possible talking about what are people we hearing out there that they want out of a given relationship, procurement strategy, or project, okay? So let's keep this in the back of our minds as we talk through and as the funnel kind of narrows. We're going to kind of take what we were just talking about around outcomes, and we're going to layer that over this shifting landscape. And here's what I mean. On the left side of your screen, what I'm going to call the traditional procurement model is represented. Here is kind of how we all have done business in kind of historically, right? Where an owner of a building, an owner of an asset is kind of responsible for all aspects of a procurement. We're talking about managing all of the various consulting parties. We're talking about managing contractors, ongoing maintenance, financing, vendors and services, et cetera. And it's really the responsibility of a business owner to bear those risks, Right. So on the left side of your screen, you're seeing that traditional model. What we are seeing across the industry is a shift. And that's really what the function is today, to talk about that movement towards something that we're going to call more of a performance-based model. And what you're going to see is, or what is characterized by, a shift in the responsibilities and the risks associated with asset ownership. So you're seeing things like all of those, that list there around owner's risks, moving from the owner side of the equation into what we'll call the provider or the service partners responsibilities. Okay. So we're moving from, again, the owner being responsible for managing all of those components into something that's much more goal and outcome focused, guaranteed, and kind of structured around us or the various service providers managing those risks. On the bottom of the screen, I've characterized what I'll call a spectrum of various kind of arrows in the quiver to accomplish that task, some of which have been around for decades and some of which are fairly bespoke and are now kind of being flushed out. This isn't to denigrate one method or methodology or modality over another, as much as it is to show that there are various kind of applicable solutions depending on your given need and structure. And we're going to dig into what I'll call kind of the middle to the right side of this spectrum. But performance contracting being kind of a tried and true method we're all very aware of and familiar with. Power purchase agreements being another kind of performance-based model typically utilized for renewable energy projects. And then those slightly more bespoke or newer to the marketplace kind of modalities on the right side of the screen there, all the way to the right, to the extent of buildings as a service, where we're talking about large consortium-based, 30 to 40 year kind of mortgage type arrangements. And so you see this kind of spectrum. And again, today, as we kind of narrow through that funnel, we're going to land somewhere in that infrastructure decarbonization as a service kind of discussion. And so as we talk through how this gets applied, I want you to remember this is one modality of several, and to find the right kind of fit as the models shift from what we'll call traditional into a more performance-based structure. To go a little bit deeper, Kip will tag in here.
Yeah, so, kind of looking at what Zach was talking about there, applying that to the concept of, traditional performance contracting. We've seen that evolve into, in a lot of cases, power purchase agreements with regards to renewable energy. But then, really just taking a step back from what we're talking about and looking at this as kind of broader societal trends. So it's not just happening, with respect to, energy efficiency or renewable energy. This is something that we've seen through a number of different industries. Amazon Web Services. I remember, as do probably some of you at least, having to host your own little mini data center at your business. That has definitely moved, and at this point, everything's hosted in the cloud, which is an as a service infrastructure provider. We see that, with modalities like Slack coming on board, where, we all used to host Exchange servers on our site. All of that's being kind of moved into the cloud, provided as a service. And, even into some of the consumer trends, Airbnb. Historically, you've seen, large commercial hotels and, other kind of commercial providers wrapping everything. And now you have service providers that are leveraging infrastructure that's already available to give people the service that they want versus the infrastructure, the capital that they need. So, taking that perspective in hand, we can look at, what is infrastructure as a service, what is, energy efficiency as a service, what we call sustainable energy as a service is kind of a higher level description of all these. But it's really, it's third-party ownership. From our perspective, we model it as off balance sheet, so it doesn't impact, your credit, your ability to, raise a bond or debt for other projects. It's pay for performance or service, depending on how you qualify that. And it should be open source, so you're not locked into one proprietary, unit, you're able to still receive the service, the benefit, the information that you want through the use of the service. And then it should create both immediate and long-term savings. So that's kind of the box that we're going to be looking at this from. So looking at that specific box here, and this is the energy efficiency, renewable energy as a service market. It, as Zach mentioned, it is still relatively niche. It's growing. Obviously, we're all very familiar with solar, wind, some of the others, but this is a significant market already, and it's projected to grow extremely quickly, just given some of those tailwinds that we just talked about with regards to the societal trend to as a service. So North America, within the next 5 to 10 years, expected to, 5 to 10x, growing to 12 plus billion. The global market, roughly 2.5 times that. I will hand that back to you, Zach.
Yeah, thanks, Kip. So again, as we layer kind of these concepts on top of each other, we're getting more and more kind of crystallized around how this may be applicable to a given organization. Throughout, we're going to hit on a couple of core concepts. And I want, if nothing else kind of goes home with you today, a few of these core concepts hopefully will be in your back pocket as you kind of contemplate procurement strategies in the future. So core concept number one is results, not assets, right? This concept is kind of fundamental as we talk about how to deploy a service-based methodology or modality. So what I mean is it's focused, or what you are paying for is an outcome, not buying an asset. And so, a couple examples there, right? You're paying for efficiency versus owning an HVAC system. You're paying for security as opposed to owning access controls. You're paying for safety as opposed to owning your fire suppression system. So this is kind of a critical concept as we move forward here. You are paying for what we'll call the beneficial use of assets as opposed to buying the assets themselves. So to kind of drive that home, or to frame that in your mind, if you will, what we are looking at is you can kind of take, I hate the word lease, right? But use in the back of your mind, if you all remember from your office days, copiers, right? Where it was typically structured where it was a service providing a copier and you were paying, 3 cents per page for that output from the copy machine. And, it was their job to maintain and service the copier, et cetera. All you were paying for was the number of pages that were coming out of that machine. We're going to take, however kind of applicable that may be, it's an appropriate proxy, it's no longer leasing, et cetera. But we're going to take that kind of overarching archetype, we're going to press that into, like, let's use a chiller as an example, right? The same basic idea. Now we're looking at, as opposed to cents per page, we're just looking at, let's say, chilled water at $1 per BTU, excuse me. So it's still that same concept, output of the machine that you are paying for as opposed to the machine itself. So the way that we can structure that would be under an agreement that would kind of address all of the capital needs without that capital investment or that outlay up front. And again, it's a usage-based payment structure. So again, it's about how much you're using as opposed to, say, a loan or a fixed payment schedule. Kind of core concept as well is this idea of guaranteed performance, right? And so again, we're going to be tying some of those core concepts around performance contracting and other performance-based modalities into this and wrapping it into this offering or this idea as well. So you're seeing guaranteed performance levels around a lot of varying outputs. And so I think the key concept is that it is very flexible and it's going to be tailored to the specific assets and projects being developed. And that you'll see me talk about this in another couple slides, but the idea here is that it's a defined outcome that's going to be co-authored. It's going to be based on your specific facility and the output specifications as appropriate. And so it really is fairly tailored to and dependent on your facility and the tailored needs thereof. Let me kick it back over to Kip to talk about how this can look from a cash flow perspective, or at least what our structuring is attempting to do.
Absolutely. So we're trying to take this kind of high level core concept that we've been talking about and illustrate really what does that look like from an organizational perspective. So in this case, we're looking at it from the perspective of a utility bill. That could be electric, gas, it could be some type of water, wastewater, but the idea is still the same kind of across the board there. So the idea here is that we are operationalizing whatever this service is. So it's only going to impact the operating costs. There will be no capital cost associated with it. So in this case, you basically take your utility bill prior to the project being implemented, which is illustrated by that kind of pre-year zero shading there. And that illustrates what you're paying as far as your utility bill goes prior to implementation of any project. The idea here is that the project is implemented in year zero, and then we look at the outcomes of that project. So what it does is it reduces your utility bill by some amount. And that amount of reduction is shared in some percentage between the provider and the host where the project's being implemented at. That amount of sharing or cost savings for the host is going to be determined by a number of different factors, the ROI of the project itself, but then also the term of the project. There's an ability to increase the term of the project to increase the amount of day one savings that it provides. Conversely, there's a way to shorten the term of the project, reducing the amount of day one savings provided, but also managing to basically complete the term of the project as quickly as possible. The idea there is that in some cases, the focus may be on day one savings. In some cases, the focus may be on some type of, needed equipment replacement. And it's really bespoke, geared to what best, provides value through that project. Again, 100% of the funding is provided upfront. There is no capital required, and this is all on your operating budget. So there is no impact to, capital budget. There's no impact to balance sheet. There's no impact to credit. Okay.
Let's dig into that just a little bit further. So I don't want anyone to be intimidated by this slide. It's fairly basic when we kind of unpack it a little bit, but this is kind of the overarching structure that we're talking about. Again, the funnel continues to narrow. We're kind of getting into specifics now, but don't get too hung up on this. Real quickly, the core concept here is that there's a special purpose entity you'll see on the left side of your screen in the center there. That is going to be the entity created by a service provider that would kind of handle all of the components of a given contract. So they're going to be the asset owner, as Kip indicated. They're going to facilitate all of the financing, as Kip indicated, design and all of the implementation, the installation, and to the extent appropriate, maintenance work ongoing as well. And there's a lot of kind of flexibility in that maintenance box to make sure we're working right alongside our partners and to make sure that we're not kind of overstepping our bounds, making sure that we're playing with the kind of site experts and making sure we're coming alongside and complementing your team as opposed to quote unquote, replacing team members in that aspect. So that special purpose entity is going to be kind of the core entity that's going to facilitate everything that you would normally have had to facilitate internally under a traditional procurement strategy. What they are going to provide on the right side of the screen would be your organization's an outcome co-authored based on, again, the appropriate KPIs as we establish them in the contracting and kind of development phase of a project, whether that be an energy target, an uptime guarantee, an ISO certification, a specific temperature, whatever that ends up being. It's those outcomes that are being kind of established and structured around from that special purpose entity. Now, as Kip mentioned, typically from an operating budget, a service payment is then made back to the special purpose entity over the term of the contract. So it's in this structure that we are able to kind of achieve those benefits that Kip mentioned, again, getting off balance sheet, et cetera, because the special purpose entity is the technical owner of all of the assets, facilitating the financing, et cetera. The end of the term, there's four kind of main options after a service contract has come to term. And so it's typical kind of financing end of term options that are pretty critical when it comes to accounting perspective. So nothing that should be too surprising for folks here. Renewing, right? So you get to the end of term, you say, I'm not sure what we want to do here. We can extend a contract ongoing. You could, look at a technology refresh if it was time to pull out assets, refresh those assets, and then establish a new contract term. Probably the most common would be a purchase agreement at the end of term, in which a third party establishes a fair market value for those assets, and you can purchase them from Johnson or any service provider that is implementing the project. Or there is that ability to return, terminate, or technically, a lot of times we build in an abandon clause as well. So there's kind of those four main avenues at the end of a term by which a company can either extend a contract or procure the equipment. It's another core concept slide. As I said, these will be kind of peppered throughout. This is an important one. So what I like to talk about here is kind of piggybacking on the cash flow that Kip shared. And this is what I'm going to call procurement versus a service modality. What you see on your screen is the blue line is what we're going to call your traditional procurement. And in year one, this idea would be you need to replace some large system in your building. Year one, you buy it outright. You're going to see a large capital spend. For the first couple of years of asset ownership, it's going to kind of do what it needs to. But then in year 4 or 5, something will break. And traditionally, that's your job to then fix. You're going to pay to fix that out of your capital budgets. Years 5 and 6 and 7, it kind of is doing what it's supposed to. Then something bigger breaks. Again, your responsibility to fix it. Years 8, 9, 10 on, you're seeing an aged asset that is not performing quite like it was when it was new, and anything that kind of goes wrong, it breaks. And in years 10, 10 plus, you're looking at those situations where it may be a larger overhaul or a replacement scenario. And so all of those things, you can kind of see that up and down of the cash flow, if you will, in a traditional procurement. Now let's put that against the green line, which is the as a service line. So now what you're seeing is a much smaller initial investment and a much more stable platform to build around than the traditional procurement line. And so you're not seeing those same ups and downs. It's tied to the specific outcome that you're trying to achieve. And from a net present value perspective, and I think this is critical, if we can go back to year 0 on this chart, and we net present value both of those lines back, if you can give me that those two things are close to equal or even slightly accretive to a services platform, you can see the substantial benefit in shifting a lot of the risks and rewards, or a lot of the risks and responsibilities off of your organization and into somebody whose kind of critical and main mandate is to do these, to kind of manage these assets. And so, for everyone on the phone here, your main job for the most part is not to run buildings, is not to provide, healthy air or whatever that may be, right? Your mission critical activities are around keeping municipalities running, educating the next generation, et cetera. So by turning over those kind of commission or those, let's call them ancillary services that you are not in business to do, we can see that not only does it create a much more stable kind of costing platform, but it's also shifting those risks and responsibilities as well.
So just jumping in off of what we were just talking about, this idea of, kind of balancing the difference between traditional procurement and as a service, and looking at it from a net present value perspective, I also want to, have a little discussion here around what we've seen historically as far as what a capital improvement process looks like for an organization. Historically, you're looking out, maybe 2, 3, 5 plus years as far as what your capital improvement budget looks like and when those projects are going to come online. Now, the idea here is that just from a gross cash flow perspective, without even any net present value or discounting, that by implementing all of the projects that you're looking for over the next X amount of time immediately through a third-party provider who's able to fund those 100% day one, you can actually see gross cash flows that are greater by using a service than you can through implementing projects over time. And what this graph shows here is actually a real world example. When we started seeing this, is a little bit surprising on our end as well, but real world example, this is a project of about $5.5 million that was originally slated to be built out over about 5-year incremental periods. Customers looking at it from the perspective of, well, I can build it out over 5 years, or I can build it all today using somebody else's money and have them kind of manage and give me those results we've been talking about. What does that look like side by side? So the traditional procurement here, what we call cash, is this almost blue-gray line. But you can see there's an initial outlay to get the first part of the project in line, and then you start to see some savings from that. You then have a little bit more capital outlay to get the next part of the project in line. You start to see a little bit more savings from the two combined, and that goes on and on for the 5-year period. And then you see, the total amount of savings paying back that project after that. Now, through a service, again, you're sharing a part of those savings, but you also don't have any capital outlay. So you're immediately cash flow positive, and that builds over the course of the agreement, which in this case is 10 years. And then at the end of that, as we just mentioned, there's the ability to, pay for some, at that point, fair market value, which we've actually incorporated in this cash flow. And after that, you're realizing all the savings from all of those projects, basically at the same slope as you would from a cash project. So again here, it's just to illustrate, by accelerating implementation of projects, you're able to capture all of the savings much more immediately. And if you're looking at this from a sustainability lens, you're also capturing all of that carbon reduction, all of that kind of net benefit to your constituents or stakeholders immediately. So comparing them side by side and looking at kind of the difference over time, is a little bit different than looking at it just from that net present value perspective. And then just to try and summarize, the way we kind of see this versus traditional procurement, and there are absolutely a lot more reasons for either or outside of this. But, financially, no capital outlay. You're getting all the benefits of projects for your facilities and your organization, using someone else's capital. Immediate positive cash flow. And that's an important one depending on your constituents, how you're raising your capital. Because a lot of times, even if you have the availability of capital, you have the credit to raise it, you have constituents in your community or in your organization, that just don't want to take on more debt. You're paying only for measured savings. So this is a little bit different than the traditional procurement where maybe there's a savings guarantee or something like that. Here, the relationship is much more direct. You're not putting any money up front. There's no risk. You're literally only paying for the savings measured. Optimized procurement process. So you can take all of those, 5, 10 projects over a capital improvement and do them all at once. You can take one contract and blend it over multiple facilities or multiple types of equipment. It just makes it much more streamlined. From the operational perspective, this can be a turnkey approach, not just in the actual implementation phase, but also, providing O&M, sharing O&M, it's doing measurement and verification. It's much more of a partnership to get you the results that you want versus just a procurement process where you get some equipment that then you're going to have to manage. And I think the last one I want to talk about here a little bit is something that's become a lot more important to folks over the past year and a half, which is really managing to a cleaner and safer environment for your employees, for your stakeholders, your residents. It's making sure that, we have our facilities holistically in the best shape they possibly can be to provide the best, safest experience for those people using them.
So that's our prepared presentation. I do want to have as much time as possible to just kind of talk through various implications, how this could potentially apply for folks, and just address any questions that might be out there. Key takeaways are around those core concepts. Again, that shifting modality from traditional to a service base, and then the various ways that that can be deployed in a variety of different organizations. So I really appreciate everyone's time today. Let's just open it up for discussion, questions, unmute yourselves and ask away, type into the chat as appropriate. Kip and I are available to answer those questions now.
Zach, I'm not seeing any questions coming yet, so I've got one that I wanted to ask.
Please, John.
So I want to go back to a little bit the concept of off balance sheet and maintaining debt ratios, allowing some flexibility from the financial side. When I look at it in my logical kind of take on it, you're still having a commitment, right, over a service term of probably between 10 and 20 years. That is a liability. So could you maybe provide some clarity on how that is addressed and how it's not necessarily reflected on the balance sheet as a liability?
Yeah, that's great. So Kip, do you want to start, or would you like me to start?
I'm happy to start on this one.
Sure.
So first, I'm just going to make, that standard statement. I am not an accountant. I'm not providing tax advice. At the bare minimum, I play one on TV. But, this idea of off balance sheet has been clarified pretty recently through, an accounting standard, ASC 842. And it really looks at what constitutes a lease and what constitutes a service agreement. So historically, leases have been able to be both on balance sheet and off balance sheet. A capital lease was historically considered on balance sheet. An operating lease was considered off balance sheet. With this latest round, and actually the one previous, 840, operating leases longer than a year have basically been determined to be on balance sheet. So you have to capitalize them and you have to show them on your balance sheet. So what we're really focused on is, why is this a service agreement versus a operating lease? Because service agreements are still off balance sheet. Now, for public organizations, GASB, which is kind of their accounting standards board, made this very clear with regards to power purchase agreements. They actually have an example in there determining that power purchase agreements are indeed a true service arrangement and they're off balance sheet. So extrapolating from that, a service agreement where you're paying for basically each unit of energy saved, whereas in a power purchase agreement, you're paying for each unit of energy produced, uses the exact same structure. As we had mentioned, the end of life term options are almost the exact same as power purchase agreement. As long as you really adhere to that methodology, there's a very clear argument that these should be off balance sheet. In ASC 842, they actually have 4 questions that you have to answer. If you can answer any of the 4 as a no, it's considered to be a service agreement and not a lease. That's probably a little bit more in depth than we want to go here to get through them all, but I'm happy to follow up with anyone who wants to dive deeper. So that's where I'll leave it, but open to a broader discussion around it.
Great, thanks, Kip. What other questions do we have?
So Kip, maybe you can speak to briefly where you're seeing, especially in the kind of municipal and K-12 space, why someone would be kind of looking at this modality, or what you've seen as examples of why someone would go this way versus traditional kind of procurement. In my mind, you and I have talked about, to your point, right, the political aspects of not being able to pass something, or do you want to elaborate any on kind of what you've seen in that?
Yeah, so I think one is just familiarity with the concept.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, I think from a federal perspective, they've made use of this kind of shared savings model more just because they've had a mandate to. You know, I think as we've kind of seen, you know, the rise of the power purchase agreement and solar, as we've seen some of these other avenues kind of enter in, this familiarity with it's happening more and more. I think, you know, from the perspective of, you know, where you have a political mandate to become more sustainable, or you have a political mandate to hit X amount of renewable energy, you know, but then there's this disconnect, like you said, between, you know, the political stakeholders and this kind of mandate. Everybody wants to be able to do this, but a lot of times when it comes down to it, you know, would you rather spend your money on roads or, you know, physical infrastructure that benefits the entire community versus improving your facilities, you know, or your wastewater treatment plant, you know, or something else? The infrastructure that people use every day connects much more directly with your constituents versus some of the stuff they don't see every day. So it's balancing what people want with what they're really willing to pay for. And by going this route, by keeping it off balance sheet, you know, it's just one more tool in your belt to be able to provide people with what they want without having to ask them for, you know, an incremental tax base raise on their property tax, or without an added service fee for some of the services provided. So, you know, again, it's not for every single situation, but it definitely provides an additional tool.
Right. I think that's great. Thanks so much, Kip.
How about, I'm curious to know what pushback maybe you guys have heard from either procurement departments where, you know, this is a paradigm shift and maybe something they're not as comfortable or familiar with. So curious to hear what pushback and what hurdles maybe you guys have seen.
Sure. So one that was interesting to me that I didn't anticipate coming from more of a commercial background was this idea around existing staff. So in the commercial space, if I can provide headcount savings, right? If a service provider is providing more of the maintenance and ongoing operation of a given asset, that may lead to a staff reduction on behalf of a commercial entity, and they are excited about that. That is savings. In a municipal or government or K-12 setting, that's not an exciting idea, right? We do not want to lose headcount. We do not want to see people lose their jobs. That is not part of the equation. And so finding ways to make sure that we are redeploying, reutilizing, and working very closely with existing staff has been paramount. And we have some real creative ways that we can do that, to the extent of labor agreements, et cetera, where, you know, if they're working on our equipment or in our, you know, let's call it a modular chiller plant or something, they're our employees. And then when they're outside of that building, they're district employees again, or whatever that looks like, right? So that we can balance that equation and make sure we're not losing headcount, we're not losing staff, but that we're redeploying and kind of making best use of and that existing staff. So that was one that I've taken away recently. Anything to add, Kip?
Nope.
Okay.
Okay, and Eric, yes, we will share the slides for you. I'll get a copy of those from Zach, and we'll post them on our Google Drive, and we'll also be posting this on our YouTube channel. So you'll be able to access those slides. Zach, if that's okay.
Yep, sounds great.
Okay, what other questions do we have? Anything else before we wrap up? Okay, well, hearing none, Zach, thank you so much. Kip, thank you. Really appreciate you guys being here. And thank you everyone for joining. And again, please check out our YouTube channel, and there'll be some more content coming. So have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
And you as well. Thank you all.